The lights in the studio were bright enough to turn every face into a spotlight. But nobody knew that by the end of the show, the brightest thing in that room wouldn't be the bulbs overhead. It would be the courage of a man in a wheelchair, and the choice of one host who finally said, "Enough." People had lined up outside, expecting nothing more than a feel-good game show taping, a few laughs, some silly answers, maybe a family walking out with a cash prize. What they got instead was a moment that would follow them home, replay in their minds, and quietly ask them, "What would you have done if you were there?" It was a special episode of a show called Family Face-Off, one of those programs where families stand in neat lines behind podiums and try to guess the most popular answers on a survey board. The theme that day was Families Who Inspire, and the studio was decorated with banners about courage, resilience, and hope. The audience was buzzing, still riding the high from the previous game. Confetti clung to jackets and camera cables. The floor manager signaled for quiet. The music faded and the host, Marcus Lane, strode out with that easy swagger people knew from their living rooms, charming, quick-witted, and always ready with a joke. On one side of the stage stood the Rivera family from Oregon. At the center was Elena, a high school counselor who had a way of smiling with her whole face. Beside her were her husband, her teenage daughter, her older son, and at the end of the line, her younger brother Leo. Leo Rivera was 29, thin, dark-haired, and seated in a sleek power wheelchair. Cerebral palsy made his movements jerky and his speech a little slower, but there was nothing slow about his mind. He was a software engineer who'd built accessibility apps used in hospitals and schools, tools that translated limited movement into clear communication, that turned small gestures into big, meaningful messages. This show was Leo's dream. He'd watched Marcus for years, through surgeries, through long nights in rehab centers, through those days when strangers stared too long or spoke too loudly, as if rolling instead of walking meant you couldn't hear. When his family got the call that they'd been selected, Leo had practiced answers at home in front of a mirror, laughing at his own mistakes, imagining the sound of studio applause wrapping around him like a warm blanket. On that stage, under those lights, he wasn't the guy in the wheelchair. He was just one more contestant getting a shot. On the opposite side stood the Dalton family from Texas. Leading them was Rick Dalton, a 40-year-old car salesman whose slicked back hair and sharp suit screamed, "Look at me." From the moment he stepped into the building, he'd treated the studio like his personal stage, high-fiving strangers, calling out jokes, flexing for the cameras. Behind him stood his wife, his teenage daughter Emily, his younger brother, and his mother. They smiled and laughed, but there was a tightness around a few of their eyes, the kind that suggested they'd seen Rick's jokes cross the line before. Marcus called Elena and Rick to the main podium for the first face-off. The board flickered, then flashed the first question in big white letters. Name something that makes a person a hero. It was the perfect prompt for an episode like this, the kind that usually brings out answers about bravery, sacrifice, standing up for others. Elena hit the buzzer first. "Overcoming hardship," she said, voice clear. Her family clapped and chanted encouragement. The board turned, and there it was. Number 2 answer. The audience cheered. Then Rick lunged for his buzzer with a half grin. "Saving someone's life," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The board lit up again. Number 1. His family went wild, yelling and bumping shoulders like they'd already won it all. They chose to play the round, and as Marcus walked toward the Dalton side, his gaze drifted across to the Rivera line. Rick's eyes did too. They slid down the line until they landed on Leo's wheelchair, on the footrests, on the slightly curved joystick under his hand. And then, because he'd always gotten laughs by punching down and no one had taught him any different, Rick leaned toward his microphone and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, at least our team doesn't need a parking space on stage just to compete." The sound left the room all at once. It wasn't just quiet, it was shocked, brittle silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle. Somewhere in the audience, someone whispered, "Did he really just say that?" Elena's hands flew to her mouth. Leo's niece instinctively stepped closer to his chair, as if she could shield him from words that had already landed. Leo's eyes dropped to his lap, his fingers resting on his armrests a moment ago, curled into tight fists. Marcus froze mid-stride. The wide television grin that had been so automatic for years vanished. He turned back toward Rick, and the expression on his face wasn't one viewers were used to seeing. There was no banter in his eyes, no playfulness, just disbelief and something deeper, heavier. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and deadly calm. Rick gave an awkward laugh, shrugging like it was no big deal. "Come on, man, it's a joke," he said. "Relax." Marcus's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, everybody in the building waited to see if he'd do what entertainers are expected to do, smooth it over, crack a new joke, move the show along. Instead, he took off his mic pack, set it carefully on the podium, and walked off the set without another word. The audience didn't know what to do. Some people sat stunned, others glanced at the exits as if they'd accidentally wandered into something too raw to witness. Emily stared at her father, her face drained of color. Rick's grin finally fell apart. "Where's he going?" he muttered. No one answered him. Elena crossed the stage to her brother as quickly as she could. Leo's shoulders shook with silent emotion. He swallowed and forced out words, slow and rough. I'm sorry," he said. Sorry for what? For sitting there, for existing. It was the apology of someone who'd spent his life feeling like the burden in the room whenever things got awkward. "Hey," Elena said, dropping to her knees, so she was level with him. Look at me. You don't ever apologize for being here. You hear me? Not now, not ever." She grabbed his hand, and his niece wrapped her arms around his shoulders, tears brimming but not falling yet, as if they were both holding the rest of the world at bay. Backstage, Marcus paced a narrow hallway, still wired to the energy he'd walked away from. Crew members stood back, giving him space. "I can't go out there and pretend this is just television," he said to the producer, Priya, who had followed him. "I'm not going to stand next to that man and act like it's fine. It's not fine." He didn't just hit a contestant with a cheap joke. He hit every person who's ever been made to feel small because of a wheelchair or a cane or a difference. Priya let him vent before she spoke. "You're right," she said quietly. "What he said was ugly, and we'll deal with him. We can cut his family from the episode. We can ban them from the show. But Marcus, there's a young man out there who came here because you make him forget people like that exist for half an hour. His name is Leo. He's been talking about this for months. He practiced answers in front of the mirror. He saved up for the trip. Right now, he thinks he broke the show. He thinks he's the problem. If you don't go back, that's the story he walks away with." Those words landed hard. Marcus stopped pacing. The image of Leo's bowed head flashed in his mind. This episode was supposed to be about inspiring families. Instead, it had exposed how fragile dignity could feel when someone decided to stomp on it. Marcus drew a long breath, wiped the moisture from the corners of his eyes, and straightened his jacket. "Okay," he said. "Then we don't go back to the show. We go back to the truth. Cameras on. Fine. Let's make them count." When he stepped back out onto the stage, the energy had changed. No theme music played. The audience didn't cheer. They watched. Marcus didn't take his usual place at the center. He walked straight to Leo and lowered himself down beside the wheelchair, one knee touching the floor so they were eye to eye. "Leo," he said, and the microphone picked up every word. "I want you to hear me clearly. You did not cause what just happened. You didn't ruin anything. Your presence here is not something this show has to work around. You belong on this stage as much as any person who has ever been here. And as far as I'm concerned, you had to fight harder than most of them to get here, which makes your place here even more earned." Leo met his gaze, tears finally spilling over. Marcus turned toward the cameras, the audience, and then finally toward Rick. "What we just heard," he said, "wasn't a joke. A joke is supposed to make people feel connected. That line was meant to make one man feel bigger by making another man feel small. And I want every person watching this here or at home to understand something. People who use wheelchairs aren't taking up space they don't deserve. The problem isn't the chair. The problem is the mindset that can only see the chair and not the person in it." He looked straight at Rick. The spotlight seemed harsher now, less forgiving. "Rick," he said, "I'm going to give you a choice. You can look at Leo and his family and give them a real apology. No excuses, no, if you were offended. You can admit that what you said was cruel and wrong. And then you can leave this stage with whatever dignity you've got left. Or you can double down. Say it was just a joke. Tell us all to lighten up. But if you do that, your daughter standing right behind you is going to spend the rest of her life remembering exactly what kind of man her father chose to be when it counted." The camera found Emily's face. She was crying now, hands balled into fists at her sides. Rick opened his mouth, then closed it again. "It was just..." He started weakly, but Marcus cut him off. "No," he said. "We are not going to call cruelty just a joke today, not on my stage." Then Marcus turned, softening as he looked at Leo. "Tell them what you do," he said. "Tell them who you are." Leo took a breath. With the help of his assistive device, his words came out clear, measured, and impossible to ignore. "I'm a software engineer," he said. I design accessibility apps that help people with disabilities communicate and live more independently. My tools are used in hospitals, schools, and homes. Thousands of people rely on them. The applause started even before he finished the sentence. People stood. They clapped, whistled, cheered his name. It wasn't the polite, scripted applause of a studio audience doing what the signs told them to do. It was raw, grateful, angry, hopeful, all at once. For the first time that day, and maybe for the first time in a long time, Leo felt the weight shift. He wasn't being tolerated. He was being celebrated. Marcus waited until the sound finally ebbed. "This man," he said, gesturing to Leo, "has probably helped more people in his 29 years than most of us will in our entire lives. He's turned his challenges into tools that give other people freedom. And you thought you could reduce that to a punchline about parking." Rick's shoulders slumped. The fight had gone out of him. Before he could respond, Emily did something that would be remembered long after the credits rolled. She stepped away from her family, crossed the stage, and took her place beside the River Oz. "I'm so sorry," she said to Leo, her voice shaking. "That's not who I want to be. I don't want to laugh at stuff like that. You shouldn't have to hear it. Not from him. Not from anyone." Elena pulled the girl into a hug without hesitation. Leo reached out his hand, and Emily took it, their fingers interlacing in an awkward, beautiful grip. It was a small gesture, but it shifted the entire feeling in the room. The US versus them lines blurred. It wasn't families competing anymore. It was people choosing what kind of humans they wanted to be. Marcus drew in a breath and turned back to the cameras. "Here's how this is going to go," he said. "The Dalton family is disqualified from the game today. Not because we hate them, but because actions have consequences. The Rivera family will continue and face a new challenger, and we're going to play on with respect. And Rick, you're going to sit right there," he pointed to a front row seat, "and watch what dignity looks like." The rest of the show didn't feel like a typical episode. Every time Leo stepped up to answer, the audience cheered before he even spoke. Marcus never rushed him. He cracked jokes again, but always with Leo, never at him. Between questions, he asked about Leo's work, his hobbies, his dreams. Leo talked about designing tools that give people back their voices, about growing up in a world that saw his chair before it saw him, about how tired he was of being treated like an obstacle instead of a person. "My body doesn't move like other people's bodies," he said at one point, the studio silent. "But my ideas move, my heart moves, my life moves. The only thing that really slows me down is other people's assumptions." By the time the Riveras made it to the final round and won the grand prize, there were tears on the faces of audience members, crew, even a few fellow contestants waiting backstage. When the confetti fell this time, it didn't feel like just a celebration of money. It felt like a quiet, collective promise to do better. And then, as people started to gather themselves, Rick stood from his seat. Security moved toward him, but Marcus lifted a hand. "Let him come," he said. Rick walked to the stage without any of the swagger he'd had before. He stopped in front of Leo's wheelchair and stared at the floor for a moment, then forced himself to look up. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, voice hoarse. "What I said was ugly and ignorant. I've spent my life treating jokes like they're harmless, even when they hurt people. I taught my daughter to think that was okay. I am so sorry. Not just for what I said, but for how long I've been the kind of person who would say it." Leo studied him for a long second. The whole studio seemed to lean in. Then Leo lifted his hand. "I forgive you," he said quietly. "Not because what you did was small, it wasn't. But because holding on to anger would hurt me more than it hurts you. If you really mean what you just said, don't waste this. Listen, teach your daughter something different than what you showed her today." Rick's face crumpled. He nodded, tears finally spilling over. Emily rushed to his side, wrapping one arm around her father and one around Leo, hugging them both in a tangled, imperfect circle. It wasn't a tidy ending. It wasn't a miracle fix. But it was a beginning, a step towards something better than where they'd started. That episode of Family Face-Off was supposed to be about quick answers and cash prizes. Instead, it became a story people would talk about long after the set had been cleared and the cameras turned off. A story about how fast cruelty can spread and how much faster courage needs to move to stop it. About a host who decided there was a line he wouldn't cross for the sake of a laugh, and about a man in a wheelchair who proved that power isn't always loud or loudest. Sometimes it's a quiet hand extended toward someone who doesn't deserve it. And now that you've heard this story, it's your turn. If it made you think, if it made you remember a moment when someone was the butt of a joke they didn't sign up for, don't just scroll on. Tap the like button, hit subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments, Have you or someone you love ever been treated as less because of a disability? Or have you seen someone step up and say, "That's not okay," when everyone else stayed silent? Share your story below. Read what other people write. Learn from them. Because dignity is not optional, and humanity isn't conditional. The only real disability we can't afford to keep is the one that stops us from seeing the full, unfiltered worth of the person right in front of us. Let's start changing that together. One story, one comment, one brave moment at a time.